So today I'll be explaining the output gap and Okun's law. So explaining potential GDP, to fully understand the output gap concept, we have to first know how to derive potential GDP. So this is often referred to as full employment GDP, potential GDP, it's very similar to real GDP. So both are used to represent the market value of goods and services at a macro level. However, the main difference is how we measure potential GDP in various economies. So potential GDP is defined as the level of GDP that is attained in an economy when businesses have maxed out their operating capacity and workers are fully employed. So this means that the economy has therefore reached full employment. So when calculating the output gap or Okun's law value, we must know what our potential GDP value is. So explaining the output gap. So this concept is supported by economists across the world in widespread capacity, and it's used to determine if an economy is experiencing success or failure at a specific moment. So in other words, it displays how far an economy is from achieving full GDP or potential GDP. So we can derive the formula for calculating the output gap. It's just this formula right here, when y is real GDP and y to the power of p is potential GDP. So once we calculate the output gap, we can come to three possible conclusions. So if we determine that the output gap is 0, this means that an economy is producing up to its potential output and operating normally. If the output gap is a negative value, we can determine that the economy is operating below its potential output and operating inefficiently. And then finally, if the output gap is positive, we can determine that the economy is operating above its potential output and operating extremely efficiently or just efficiently. So explaining cyclical unemployment. So the cyclical unemployment rate is essential to the formula for Okun's law. So to figure out our cyclical unemployment rate, we first need to understand actual and natural unemployment rates. So the actual unemployment rate, it's quite intuitive and straightforward, I'd say, as it's the rate of unemployment currently in a country. So that's our U value in the formula. And then the natural unemployment rate, u to the power of n, corresponds directly to potential GDP, so they go hand in hand. And this type of unemployment rate is associated with an economy when it is producing at its potential GDP. So this means that the cyclical unemployment rate is the difference between the two. So it's just actual unemployment rate minus the natural unemployment rate. Now we have Okun's law. So there's a lot of info on this slide. So Okun's law formula is specifically used to display the relationship between the cyclical unemployment rate and the output gap. So they're both on each side of the equation. So this results in this formula, which is quite long, but it definitely becomes easier once we dive deeper into the topic. So when I deal with this formula, this just works for me. So I like to group the values of the cyclical unemployment rate equation with their corresponding output gap values, meaning that y to the power of p, so the potential GDP, and the natural unemployment rate always have an inverse effect on their given side of the equation. So this is the same as the actual unemployment rate and real GDP. So this means that if the output gap is negative or below potential, y to the power of p is greater than y, and u would then be greater than un. So that's kind of the inverse effect I'm talking about. And then the h coefficient right here, this just depicts how a cyclical unemployment rate changes as a result of a 1% change in the output gap. And this value is always super small, so it's always less than 1, because businesses don't want to increase employment costs at their respective firms, as it's usually not worth it to fire existing employees. And now this is just the example I made up. So in Sweden's economy during the second quarter of 2017, real GDP was 154.2 billion and potential GDP was 148.6. And then the coefficient, so this is our H value, was 0.41 for this quarter. What is the cyclical unemployment rate during this time period? So for the first solution, we first have to calculate the output gap. And this is where we use our real GDP and potential GDP values. So we have y minus yp divided by yp, so 154.2 minus 148.6 divided by 148.6, and then times 100 just to make the number look easier, equals 3.77%. And then this means that the cyclical unemployment rate, so u minus u to the power of n, is equal to this value right here times our h negative, which equals minus 0.41 times 2.77%. Equals minus 1.55%. So that would be the cyclical unemployment rate. And then here are just my citations. So thanks for watching my crash course on the output gap and Okun's law.